Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second and final webinar of the Oil Spill Modeling webinar series. Today's topic is Economic Impacts from an Offshore Oil Spill, presented by the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control and the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean. My name is Christy Liskey. I'm the Ocean Planner for Delaware Coastal Programs and will be moderating today's session. Just some things to note, we are recording today's session and we'll send you a link to the recording when it's available. Everyone will be muted throughout the webinar and there is no raise hand feature, but you are encouraged to ask questions at any time by entering them into the questions box of your control panel and they will be answered at the end. And now I would like to welcome Avalon Bristow, Program Director of the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean, to give some opening remarks. Hi, Avalon.
Thanks so much, Christy, and good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean, also known as MARCO, I'd like to welcome you to the second and final webinar in our Oil Spill Modeling webinar series, Economic Impacts from an Offshore Oil Spill. In case you missed the first webinar where we learned about oil fate and transport modeling, you can find a recording of it in the link that will be provided in the chat. MARCO is the regional ocean partnership for the Mid-Atlantic. Established in 2009 by the governors of New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, MARCO is an interstate collaboration that addresses shared regional priorities related to ocean use and planning and provides a collective voice on important ocean issues that transcend political and geographic borders. Please visit our website, www.midatlanticocean.org, to view any of our previous webinars and learn more about MARCO's work. As Christy mentioned, today's event was planned in partnership with the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control, also known as DENREC, to share results of an assessment that looked at economic impacts resulting from the modeled offshore oil spill scenarios that were described in the first webinar. Although the results are Delaware specific, DENREC and MARCO are hopeful that the results and processes used in this analysis can be applied by other states in the Mid-Atlantic to conduct their own analyses. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the planning team for their hard work coordinating these webinars over the past several months. Carrie St. Laurent, Christy Liskey, and Maggie Pletta from the Delaware Coastal Program, and Judy Tucker from MARCO. I'd also like to thank everyone in attendance for joining us today. I'm so pleased to welcome our speakers, Carrie St. Laurent and Jason Price, and I thank them for joining us today to present their assessment of economic impacts under different offshore spill scenarios. I hope you're as excited as I am to better understand the impacts of potential oil spills on Delaware's coastal communities and the resources upon which they depend, as well as risks associated with marine transportation and related activities along the Mid-Atlantic coast. With that, I'm going to pass the mic back to Christy. Thanks.
Thanks, Avalon. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Carrie St. Laurent. She manages the Applied Science section of the Delaware Coastal Programs and is going to provide some background context.
Great, thank you so much, Christy, and thank you all for attending. For context, the Coastal Zone Enhancement Program, which is also known as Section 309, encourages state coastal management programs, such as the Delaware Coastal Management Program, to strengthen and improve their program in one or more of the 9 identified enhancement areas. This includes coastal hazards. In 2019, the Delaware Coastal Management Program applied for and received a Project of Special Merit, a competitive funding program from NOAA available to coastal management programs, which includes Section 309 in their program. Our goal on this project was to help fill a knowledge gap on what the economic impacts would be to Delaware in the event of an offshore oil spill. This project has 3 goals. The first, to better understand the fate and transport of different offshore oil spill scenarios. The second, to estimate the economic impacts of these modeled spills to Delaware. And the third, to increase the data and information available to help build resiliency in Delaware's coastal communities. Today's webinar will focus on the second goal of assessing the economic impacts of the modeled oil spill scenarios, and will be presented by Jason Price from IEC. If you missed our first webinar, as Avalon said, or you just want to rewatch and re-experience it all over again, you can find a link posted on our website, and we will also be sharing that link with you soon in the chat, as well as in a follow-up email. We also have the full reports of the study posted on our website, which we will also share. So I'm very excited for this presentation, and I will kick it back to you, Christy. Thank you all.
Thanks, Carrie. And now I'd like to welcome Jason Price from Industrial Economics Incorporated. It's our main speaker today and going to give the presentation on economics impacts. Jason specializes in the design and development of economic analyses to inform energy and environmental policy at the federal, state, and local level. He has led the development of multiple economic and environmental impact modeling tools to quantify and monetize the benefits, costs, and other impacts of public policy and natural resource management decisions. These include state and federal rulemakings, policy decisions regarding the leasing of federally managed lands, incentive program development, and policy decisions related to natural resource damages. Within the offshore energy space, Jason led the development of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's Offshore Environmental Cost Model, or OECM, which the Bureau uses to assess the environmental impacts of outer continental shelf leasing scenarios. He also co-managed the Lost Recreational Use Assessment for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and has performed assessments of the environmental and economic effects of hypothetical catastrophic oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico and other regions. Jason earned his BA from Syracuse University and his master's in public policy from the University of Michigan. Jason, we're really excited to have you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Christy.
Let you go ahead and share your screen.
Sure, I just got to make sure I hit the right buttons here. And hopefully you can all see that. Let me know if you can't.
All good, Jason, thank you.
So as Christy said, I'll be covering the potential socioeconomic impacts of oil spills for the state of Delaware. And before I get into the details of my presentation, I just want to recognize others who contributed to this work at IEC and elsewhere. So internal to IEC, Derek Ernstwinder, Brian Cortez, Nick Vanderlink, and Emma Fox all played important roles in this project. And then also we worked with George Parsons from the University of Delaware. He provided some very useful expert input focused on the recreational piece of this analysis. So to put a fine point on it in terms of what our study objective was, we wanted to quantify and monetize the socioeconomic impacts of specific hypothetical scenarios, focusing on impacts to Delaware. The scope of the analysis included coastal and marine recreation. So this is beach use, fishing, and boating. Commercial fishing, separate from recreational fishing. Commercial shipping, potential response costs incurred by the state of Delaware. And then as a complement to those kind of sectoral effects, also looking at macroeconomic and fiscal impacts to Delaware resulting from these spills. And the overall analysis, which you can read about in our full report, examined 60 spill scenarios. And as I'll describe in a few minutes here, for the purposes of this presentation, we're not going to present all 60 to make this digestible, but we'll focus on the smaller number of those. The overall roadmap for what I'll be presenting here over the next 35 to 40 minutes, as I said, I'll start with an overview of the spill scenarios themselves. If you tuned in last week, you saw Jill Rowe from RPS present those as well. But for those of you who weren't on that presentation, just thought it'd be useful to provide a short overview here as well. We'll also provide a very short summary of the oil spill modeling, just to provide a little bit of context for how we're using it. And then I'll go through, for each of those sectors I walked through before, the methods that we applied at a fairly high level in the results. So rather than bury the lead with respect to the results, I thought it might be useful to give you all a preview of what we found of the 5 spill scenarios I'll be presenting today. The tables here show the estimated impacts for the highest impact of those spills. And so in the top table here, we have the socioeconomic impacts by sector, and then complementing that, the macroeconomic and fiscal effects, focusing on employment impacts to Delaware's GDP, worker income, and fiscal impacts. But just wanted to give you all a chance to kind of see the magnitude of effects and kind of where we're going at the end here. So to dive into the oil spill scenarios, we defined spills for the purposes of this project according to 5 different variables. The first is spill location. And as I said, we had 60 different spill scenarios, but for the purposes of this, we were really focused on just this location here that is has the red rectangle around it. All the scenarios that we're looking at today are from that location, but we also looked at spill locations off the coast of New Jersey and down near the entrance to Chesapeake Bay. And then we also looked at some scenarios that were farther offshore for potential well blowout scenarios. But those we won't be covering today, but we did look at a variety of locations, and so just wanted to make you aware of that. We also look at spill types, so surfaces or blowout scenario, like I mentioned, the blowout scenario is just being farther offshore in those other locations. All the spills that we'll be going over today are surface spills. We also consider whether mitigation measures are implemented in response to each spill. We're looking at both mitigated and unmitigated today. Season of the year, this actually turns out to matter a lot. So we did examine spills in all 4 seasons of the year, and the results that we highlight today will cover 2 of those seasons, summer and winter. And then finally, spill size. So we looked at, for today, we're looking at 200,000 barrel spill, 2,240 and 126 barrels. Joel Rowe described the basis for those numbers last week, and I'll refer you to our report just to, in the interest of time, for where those numbers came from. And then also we looked at a 900,000 barrel blowout scenario, which I won't be presenting today, but just wanted to highlight that was among our scenarios as well that we looked at in the broader scheme of things. So the specific scenarios for today, like I said, 5 scenarios with 3 of the 4 spill sizes there, ranging between 126 and 200,000 barrels. All but one of these scenarios are during the summer. All but one are with mitigation. And so, with those factors combined, we've got 5 spills that we're focusing on. And these spills, while certainly it's just 1/12 of the full 60 that we looked at, there are some useful lessons to be learned from focusing only on these 5. And so that's how we landed on those. So with the spill scenarios defined, like I said, our analysis is dependent on the oil spill modeling that Jill Rowe described last week using RPS's SciMap model. And without reiterating all those details, the 2 outputs from all that modeling that we relied on for this analysis were the length of shoreline oiled with exposure or oiling exceeding different thresholds of concern for specific activities. And the first map in this slide kind of shows what those results look like in graphical form. And then also the area of floating surface oil exceeding thresholds of concern as well, as shown in the lower map. And both of these maps, I don't know if you can read the print, it's rather small. These are the 200,000 barrel unmitigated surface spill for the summer. So getting into the activity specific impacts, focusing first on recreation, like I mentioned earlier, we examined 3 types of recreation: beach use, fishing, and boating. So the first step in our analysis, even before considering the oil spill modeling results, is trying to get a handle on baseline use for each of these activities. And for beach use, we relied on survey data provided by our partner, Dr. George Parsons. He has conducted numerous surveys of beach use in Delaware and the Mid-Atlantic more broadly, and we relied on his survey data for beach use. For fishing, we relied on data from NOAA's Marine Recreational Information Program. They publish data annually on fishing in different locations across the U.S. And in our use of those MRIP data, we excluded fishing that was beach-based or boat-based to avoid any double counting of recreational use associated with beach use or boating. And then for boating itself, we relied on a boater survey conducted by Monmouth University Urban Coast Institute's Mid-Atlantic group. They had conducted a survey, I think 6 or 7 years ago, that we rely on. And we distribute this activity across the year. For all 3 activities, the data sources we rely on have a temporal component to them, and in many cases a spatial component as well. For the purposes of this analysis, we defined beach use according to 6 different beach groups, without identifying the beaches associated with each. It's kind of the Delaware Bay beaches, Cape Henlopen State Park, beaches around Rehoboth, the Dewey area, the Central Atlantic coastline, the South Atlantic coastline in Delaware, and yes, that is all 6. And then you can see in this graph on the right, the distribution of activity by each activity during the course of the year. As you might expect, beach use is the most significant of the activities in terms of the amount of use measured in terms of user days, peaking in the summer. But that's not to say there's no activity in other times of the year. Obviously, people are out there in the fall and spring as well, and in a very limited extent in the winter too, going for walks with their dog on the beach and the lake. And so we relied on this temporal allocation of activity to align with kind of when spills are happening in our individual scenarios. So with this baseline use data in hand, the next step in our analysis was to intersect that with the projected oiling from the RPS oil spill modeling. And so the maps here give you a sense of what this involves. So these maps are specific to recreational fishing. The first map, and this is Fenwick Island, the first map shows the areas that were oiled along the coast of Fenwick Island. In this scenario, the whole area, each of those grid cells along the coast is oiled above the threshold of concern. In the middle map, you see the fishing sites that are from the MRIP data, and it includes sites that are near the coast as well as some back bay sites. And then in the map on the right, you see the intersection of those two. And so for the purposes of our analysis, those the easternmost sites, those 2 sites are oiled and fishing is assumed to be affected there. The other 2 sites that aren't oiled, we assume no impact. And we performed similar analyses for boating and beach use as well. So once we know kind of which areas are oiled and which potential use or uses are affected, we have to estimate the reduction in activity in those oiled areas by activity type. And to do that, we relied on historical spill experiences. And this table shows by spill scenario what the assumed reduction in use was in proportional terms for beach use and recreational fishing. And note that that percentage change in use varies by spill size in terms of the percentage value. And then also it varies in terms of the duration of the effect. So for example, the unmitigated 200,000 barrel spill, we see effects actually for 6 seasons out from the time of the spill, whereas for smaller spills, the impact is limited to just a single season. Like I said, these numbers are based on historical experience. It's useful to think first in terms of the medium-sized spill, the one that's 2,240 barrels. That is based on the American Trader spill out in Southern California that resulted in a 21-day beach closure, and that equates to a reduction of 23%. For the 200,000 barrel spills, certainly we would assume or would expect an impact at least as large as that. And looking at the only spill that's kind of close in magnitude other than Deepwater to that effect is the Exxon Valdez spill. Obviously, there's not a lot of beach use in Alaska, but we were able to look at sport fishing impacts and that proportional impact. And so we took that and layered it on top of what we had observed from the American Trader experience. And then for the 126 barrel spill, there was some uncertainty there. There's uncertainty across all of these, to be sure, but we assumed that it was roughly half of the effect for the 2,240 barrel spill. And then for boating, for 200,000 barrel spills, we started with the impact observed from Deepwater, which was 28.2% over 3 months. This is less than the 900,000 barrels, or less than the spill volume associated with Deepwater. And the Deepwater spill also just had a longer duration because it was a blowout. This is a surface spill. So we made the assumption here that the impact for boating would be shorter than the Deepwater experience by a month. And then for the 2,200 barrel spill, It's reduced use for 10 days, and for 126 barrels, it's for 5 days. And for these effects, for the 2240 and 126, there's a question of what is the percentage reduction in use in the oiled area. And with boating, it's there certainly is some uncertainty. Even if boats can steer clear, the oil is moving. There are risks to boat owners of getting their boats oiled and causing some significant damage. So we decided to do this as a range, with the low end assuming that, that the reduction in activity in an area is proportional to the fraction of the surface area that is oiled, and the high end assuming that just all boating in that activity is curtailed for that duration of impact. So applying these assumptions, that gets us to the reduction in use. Then we had to assign a dollar value to it, and we draw on the economic literature, and the values in red here show the values that we applied to beach recreation, fishing, and boating. And the dollar value here for those not typically engaged in this type of work, this represents the value that users or participants of these activities derive from participating above and beyond any cost that they incur to participate in the activity. So it's the $42 for beach uses, the value that I place on beach use above and beyond any cost for gas or entrance fees that I might pay to gain access to the beach. So in terms of our results, this shows the estimated reduction in use for each activity. And then at the top of each graph, we also have the baseline use for each activity. I mean, big picture here is that for beach use, the effect is between 0 and 30%, and for fishing and boating, the impacts are a little less. There's a big range across the scenarios here. For some insight on this, you'll notice that the unmitigated 200,000 barrel winter spill impact is 0. What that reflects is the oil spill modeling is projecting for that scenario that the spilled oil is actually pushed southward by the currents and winds that are prevalent during that season, whereas for the summer spill, it actually gets pushed into the shoreline more, so we have a much more significant effect. So that's why the impact is low for that scenario. And then we see pretty significant effects for the 200,000 barrel spills across the board. In percentage terms, like I said, beach use is the highest. Applying dollar values to these, this graph shows the value of the recreational losses across all 3 categories combined for each spill scenario. And the dark blue values, or dark blue bars, I should say, are the high end of the range that we estimated. The light blue is the low end. There's not a whole lot of distance between those 2 values, in large part because the sensitivity assumptions that we apply to get the range are really more applicable to fishing and boating, which are a smaller fraction of impacts. As you'd expect, impacts are highest for the larger spills. Mitigation, and this is obvious apparent in the graph I showed you just a moment ago too. Mitigation for the 200,000 barrel spill, so the second set of bars there, doesn't really lead to a significant reduction in recreational losses. That's not necessarily the conclusion that we'll draw for some of the other impact categories, but basically, even though mitigation does capture some of the oil, the areas oiled still are areas with high recreational activity, so there's a pretty significant effect. And like I said, no losses for the winter spill. In terms of the composition of monetized losses between the 3 activities, the 2 donut graphs here show 2 of the scenarios. The composition is roughly the same across all of them, with beach use accounting for nearly 90% in all cases, followed by boating, which in this case is between 8 and 11%, and fishing, which is a smaller fraction. But also, just to reiterate, the fishing here, the way that we're counting it, to avoid double counting, the fishing does not include beach-based or boat-based fishing, because we did not want to double count effects with beach use. So this is really fishing away from those areas. So just want to make clear that that's what that reflects. So then moving on to the next category, commercial fishing, we apply a similar approach as we do for recreation, but not exactly the same. The first step is to estimate baseline commercial fishery revenues, complements of the National Marine Fishery Service and DNRAC. We see the data for 2018 right here, both in terms of the amount of fish caught, or the pounds of fish caught, and the total value, which amounts to close to $12 million. We then allocated that across different seasons of the year. The data on fishing revenues were not by month or season, but we distributed just based on the seasons for each of the species shown in the previous table, and we wound up with this allocation across the year that you see in this graph. As you can see, it's other than the winter months, based on the way that we've done this, it's fairly uniform between March and November. So we, after allocating temporally, we also allocated spatially. So these maps, starting with the map on the left, we drew on data, a raster data set developed by the NOAA Northeast Fisheries Science Center, which basically showed the relative intensity spatially of fishing for the Delaware fishery specifically. And then we basically, using that data, allocated the fishing revenues to a series of 6.5 mile by 6.5 mile grid cells, which you see on the right. So we basically just turned the raster into gridded data. And then to get at impacts, we intersected that grid with the oiling for each scenario. And so this map on the right shows the grid from the previous slide, plus that kind of black heart shapes, black area underneath the grid is the oiling projected for that scenario. And so our assumption here, oiling above threshold of concern, which was 0.1 grams per square meter. So if a grid cell has any oiling above that threshold at all, we assume that there's a closure for that grid cell effectively. So even if it's just a sliver of oil, going through the corner of a grid cell, for the purposes of this analysis, we assume that that it's closed. The question then is, how long is it closed? And here, there certainly is uncertainty with respect to the duration of closure, but we drew on historical experience from past spills. And so starting actually from the bottom, the 200,000 barrel spill, we assume closure of 3 to 12 months. So this is a pretty significant spill with a pretty long lasting effect. For the 2,200 barrel spills, it's 1 to 5 months, and for 126 barrels, it's 1 to 3 weeks. And like I said, these are all based on past spills such as Refugio, the North Cape, and a few spills also in one of the Aegean Sea and the Sea Empress spill. So applying these assumptions, this graph shows the estimated impacts for each of the spill scenarios as a range. The left side of the blue bar showing the low end of the range, the high end reflecting the right side of the blue bar, and that dotted red line is baseline revenues, landings revenue per year for Delaware fisheries. And you might recall that was around $11.7 million for the year that we had. So under the worst case spill scenario, so the unmitigated 200,000 barrel summer spill, the impact amounts to basically you lose the fishery for the year in terms of the revenue losses. That's at the high end. At the low end, it's less than half. Similar to beach use, mitigation doesn't significantly reduce losses for that 200,000 barrel summer spill scenario in this case. And losses are lower for the winter spills, and again, that reflects what the oil spill modeling is projecting for the winter, with the oil being pushed much farther south, away from where the Delaware fishing industry is catching its fish. So moving on to the next category of commercial shipping, the potential impacts that we're looking at here arise from potential oiling blocking the entrance to Delaware Bay. And two things could happen in that scenario. One is, vessels that are either trying to exit or enter the bay are delayed. They just kind of have to, sit there until the oil is cleared and there's a path out. Or in some cases, vessels can reroute and circumnavigate the polluted area. And so in this case, Delaware Bay, there is a canal that connects Delaware Bay to the Chesapeake Bay. That is the kind of green line connecting the two bays in the map on the right. And so, vessels can take that canal. They'll travel farther, they'll incur some additional costs, but that is one way of getting around the spill. And so some vessels could potentially do that. So as a starting point, as with the other activities, we estimated the number of vessels passing through Delaware ports. This is based on data compiled by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on vessels traveling inbound and outbound to Delaware ports. We compiled those data. We also classified vessels based on whether they're inbound and outbound and whether they would either divert or delay in the event of a blockage of Delaware Bay. And we made that distinction based on whether it could get through the canal. So the canal is around 35 feet deep and you need to have 2 feet of clearance to safely pass through. And so we looked at the draft of each vessel, which thankfully the Army Corps data do include, and we basically use a threshold of 33 feet. If it's less than that, they can fit through. Otherwise, they can't. And then so based on this, we compiled the data for inbound and outbound, also separately for bulkers, tankers, and containers, and whether they're likely to divert or to delay. And you may notice that if you sum the inbound and you sum the outbounds, those numbers aren't the same. And the reason for that is that vessels sometimes may be inbound to Wilmington, but then they go on to Philadelphia. Then they exit the bay again, and they don't stop at Wilmington on the way out, so they're never outbound, going out to the Atlantic from the port of Wilmington itself. So that's the reason for that discrepancy there. So in terms of the duration of blockage, this is a key variable for figuring out what the effect is. Those numbers I showed you in the previous slide were annual figures. So based on past spills, we looked at how long the blockage of the bay is likely to be. Based on the oil spill modeling, the 126 barrel spill wouldn't lead to a blockage. For medium spills, we relied on the Texas citywide, the Athos, and the Tintamora spill, and came up with a range of 2 to 5 days. And for the highly unmitigated scenario, 4 to 7 days. That's based on the Valdez spill. The port of Valdez had closed for 4 days following that event, but the on-scene coordinator indicated that they would have preferred not to reopen quite as quickly in the aftermath of that spill. So we, at the high end, assumed 7 days. And then for the mitigated 200,000 barrel spill, we assumed that would shave a day off the blockage duration for the high unmitigated case. So for those delays, we looked at different costs that would be incurred based on whether a vessel delays or diverts. If it delays and just remains in place, there are fuel costs associated with staying in place, despite the fact that they aren't moving. And that amounted to about $7,320 for vessels that are at sea, and a little less than that for vessels that are delayed at port. And then there are also operational costs of around $6,900 a day. For diversion, there's also the fuel cost, and it depends on, we kind of parse the vessels into kind of what way they're coming from, where they're going, but on average it was 5.5 metric tons per vessel of fuel, diverted at a price of $340 per metric ton. And so we had fuel costs of $1,859. A note, this is based on fuel costs as of a couple of years ago. Fuel costs are much higher now compared to that $340 per metric ton. As of a week ago, the cost of very low sulfur fuel oil was $966 per metric ton. So we recognize that, these fuel cost numbers are subject to change with changes in fuel prices. Diversion costs also include the cost of pilotage to go across the canal. That was around $5,500, and then operational costs on top of that. So applying all of those inputs, the graph here shows the estimated impacts by scenario, similar to the commercial fishing results, showing the low and the high. Overall, costs are less than $600,000 across all scenarios, though if we were to use more updated fuel numbers, those would probably increase to closer to $1 million, but still kind of similar magnitude. Differences across scenarios shown here are directly proportional to the duration of the blockage. And most costs are actually related to delay rather than diversion, even though twice as many vessels do divert just because of the relative cost of delay being much higher than diversion. So moving on to response costs. So our objective here wasn't just to estimate the overall cost of response. We wanted to estimate the cost of response for the state of Delaware itself. What is the Delaware state government incurring in terms of response costs? And to do that, we applied two separate but related approaches. The two approaches for spills of different sizes. So for the 126 barrel and 2200 barrel spills, we applied a response cost function derived from a study conducted by Dadmar Edkin back in 2004. And that study was based on data for several thousand oil spills occurring over a 23-year period. And the function starts with a base cost per barrel based on oil type, spill type, cleanup method, effectiveness to cleanup, and the shoreline type oiled. And so drawing on that paper, this table shows kind of the starting point for those response costs. These are all per barrel. And we start with, we use the values that are in this 0% removal efficiency column because we're starting with kind of, unmitigated spills. And so that is the best representation of that in this study. And then there are also multipliers that get applied to these base values depending on the shoreline type. And this is also from that Edkin paper. And you can see here that those multipliers vary between 0.5 and 1.6, depending on whether it's basically a harder shoreline versus, at the worst case, a wetland. So that's the approach for the smaller and what we call maybe medium-sized spills is all relative here. For larger spills, that the Edkin paper didn't really it was based on spills that, for the most part, I think were, less than 20,000 barrels. And so this 200,000 barrel spill is a pretty significant, very significant, once every couple decades type spill. And so for this, we drew on the experience of Exxon Valdez and Deepwater Horizon spills. Based on available data, those spills had response costs ranging from about $5,000 to $15,000 per barrel. But those values do reflect, implementation of mitigation, and we wanted to, figure out what response costs might be without mitigation too. So we do use those values for the mitigated scenario. For unmitigated, we basically scaled those values based on differences from that Edkin paper on the difference between the different mitigation levels that were assumed there. And based on that, we have a range of the unmitigated spills of 9,700 per barrel to 17,800. And those numbers, like I said, those numbers are response cost overall. Like I said, we're trying to get response costs incurred by Delaware state agencies. So as a first step, we need to isolate spill response on Delaware's coastline in marine environment. So, for these spills, other state shorelines would be affected as well. And so we assumed to do that allocation, we looked at the amount of oiling on each state's shoreline and basically assumed proportionality. So for the unmitigated 200,000 barrel summer spill, 27% of that shoreline oiling is on Delaware shoreline. So we assume that 27% of the response costs are incurred by Delaware as well. We know that, on a spill specific basis, certainly there could be deviation from that number, but this was just meant as a way of trying to develop what we thought would be a reasonable approximation of that allocation. And then so once we've isolated a response cost specific to oiling of Delaware's coast, we do some parsing of who pays for that oiling along Delaware's coast. So there's the first parsing is, the responsible party versus, what government agencies are paying, government including both federal and state. And so according to a paper by Hilton and Penn from NOAA, the responsible party pays about 74% on average. And then for the federal versus state agency share of that remaining 26%, data published by the Coast Guard, the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund, administered by the Coast Guard, suggests that the allocation is about 40% state and 60% federal. So taking all that into account, that implies that the state of Delaware itself, the Delaware state government, would pay about 10.4% of the response costs relating to the oiling in Delaware waters. So applying all those assumptions, our response cost estimates for each spill are shown at the bottom here. Like I said, this reflects response costs incurred by Delaware state agencies, and the ranges for each scenario reflect the range per barrel that I showed you earlier. And one thing to note here, unlike recreation and commercial fishing, mitigation actually does lead to a reduction in those response costs by about 23 to 50%. And response costs are basically zero under two of the scenarios. The 126 barrel spill as a smaller spill just doesn't lead to extensive oiling along the Delaware coast. That's not to say there never would be a 126 barrel spill that results in the response cost to Delaware is just based on the spill modeling conducted for the specific scenario and the conditions assumed that the effects, that there would be response costs incurred by the state. And similarly for the winter spill, excuse me, again with the assumed wind and current conditions for the winter pushing the oil southward, there are response costs for that scenario under those assumptions regarding wind and currents, but they are, Delaware does not experience any oiling under that scenario. Okay, so complementing these kind of four sectors, recreation, commercial fishing, shipping, and response costs, we also looked at or examined the macroeconomic and fiscal impacts to the state of Delaware. And the scope of these effects is focused on impacts related to reductions in coastal recreation and commercial fishing. While there could be effects related to response costs and shipping, the magnitude of those effects was uncertain, and there was some significant possibility, for example, for intertemporal substitution of some activity. And so we decided to focus on recreation and fishing. The metrics that we look at include employment, the state's GDP, worker income, and then state government revenues. In terms of our overall approach to estimate all four of these effects, we used InPlan, which is an input-output model that captures relationships between different industries for about 546 industries. The data are all Delaware specific in this case. So InPlan has data on those inter-industry relationships by state related on Delaware specific data. And InPlan, for those unfamiliar with it, it does capture direct impacts in industries that are directly affected by an event, but also captures spillover effects. And there are two different types. There are what are termed indirect effects. So those are effects kind of up the supply chain from the affected industry. So for example, let's say for recreation, there's a reduction in hotel stays. That has implications, let's say, for if hotels use other companies, let's say for clean linens on a daily or weekly basis, that there'd be an effect on that industry as well. The second type of spillover effect is induced impacts. These are impacts related to workers in those directly and indirectly affected industries going out and spending their wages in the community on clothing, meals, entertainment, food, anything. And then for the InPlan analysis, we developed inputs that were specific to recreation and commercial fishing. So focusing first on the data inputs for recreation, what we use is the reduction in expenditures by beachgoers, recreational anglers, and boaters. For each of those categories, there actually is a data source that has detailed information on the level of spending for the average beach trip, for example, but also the composition of that spending. And for beach use, NOAA conducted a survey back in 2012 collecting that information. NOAA also published a report on the economic contribution of marine angler expenditures that includes that for fishing. And then for boating, we did identify a survey conducted by Monmouth University's Urban Coast Institute that we relied upon. So starting with beach expenditures, The table on the left here shows on average, per user day, the average expenditure is close to $110. And just a few things to note about this to provide some context for these values. This represents the representative beachgoer. So it's you can think of it as a composite for people who come to Rehoboth and spend a week there from outside of town, but also includes locals who just get in their car, drive to the beach, spend a few hours there, and then go home. So that first hypothetical person I described, will have a hotel stay. The second person won't. So you can see here that if you look about 5 lines down in that table, the lodging value is $28.60. That's not to say that someone found a hotel room for $28.60 at Rehoboth. It's just in effect a weighted average among people who do get a hotel room and people who don't. And we did exclude a few expenditures from the figure that we used for in-plan. So that survey that we mentioned earlier, it includes expenditures on consumables as well as semi-durables and highly durable goods, including boats. Highly durable goods we excluded. I think the survey was intended to capture all spending associated with a person's overall beach use, but since we're looking at marginal changes in trips, we don't want to assume that. We're assuming that people's purchases of boats and those other more highly durable goods are unaffected. Then similarly for fishing and boating, we have spending of $93 a trip for fishing, and for boating, you'll see that there are 2 columns here. It was a survey of boat owners, and since there are other people on the boat, usually for boating trips, the average we applied is 2.6 individuals per boat trip. We made the assumption that the boat owner's response was capturing spending for others on the boat. So we made the assumption that the boat owner effectively is kind of playing hosts, and so the fuel costs are incurred by the boat owner, but also food and gear and other supplies as well. And so the average expenditure of $350 per boat owner, we spread over those average 2.6 individuals per trip to get $133 per boater per trip. And then for commercial fishing, our inputs included the direct effect of the commercial fishing industry itself. So like I said, on the high end, that was kind of 1 year's worth of revenues that was input directly into in-plan. But there are also downstream industries, seafood processing, restaurants, wholesalers, and retailers. And in-plan, it captures impacts from the point you're looking at in the supply chain and upstream. It does not capture downstream, so we had to develop some separate inputs to capture these industries downstream from the fishing industry itself. And so we developed one set of inputs for processors and restaurants based on the ratio of the total output of those industries to food output. And then for wholesale and retail, we developed inputs based on in-plan's retail and wholesale margins for seafood. And then getting to our results, shown here for each of the 4 metrics that I mentioned before. The highest employment impact, looking at the graph in the upper left, of about 3,600 jobs. To provide some context for that, that represents about 0.8% of Delaware state employment. So if you think about the economy or employment growing at 2% a year, that's a sizable chunk of that. Similarly for GDP, the effect is around 0.5%. And similar to the other effects that we looked at earlier, impacts are highest for the summer spills and the larger spills, with impacts for the unmitigated winter spill being low for the reasons I mentioned before with respect to the oil spill modeling, and lower volume spills leading to smaller effects. And then also these graphs show the composition of impacts across direct, indirect, and induced effects, with direct impacts dominating across the board. Direct impacts are highest for employment compared to, let's say, labor income and GDP. And that reflects the high degree of labor intensity for the industries that are directly dependent on coastal and marine resources. So to wrap things up, kind of looking across all these categories, and I realize I flew through a lot here, a few themes emerged from our results. One is the spill timing matters a lot for the impacts of the spill. A spill that is otherwise the same in terms of the size and the oil type and location, in some cases led to drastically different results in the summer versus the winter, with winter resulting in no impacts in many cases, and summer, more than $100 million. Among those four broad sectors, the recreation, fishing, shipping, and response costs impacts are most significant in absolute terms for recreation. Commercial fishing impacts, however, if you're looking at the effect relative to a baseline level of activity, was more significant. And then another lesson that emerges from this is that mitigation, in some cases, reduces socioeconomic impacts. In other cases, it doesn't. It depends on what we're looking at. And we didn't see much of a reduction for recreation or commercial fishing, but we did see more of an effect for response costs and shipping. Then finally, just the key takeaway is that these spills, if they happen at the right time in the right place, can be pretty disruptive to Delaware state economy, dislocating thousands of workers and basically eroding a third or half of what you'd expect in terms of economic growth in any given year. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Jason, thank you so much. That was really informational. I'm getting some feedback here, so hopefully we can fix that. But that was really valuable information. I want to thank you for all the work that you did on this project. We do have a couple questions. We can go ahead and get right started. Our first question is, how did the money per day loss figure come about? Specifically that $44 per day beach use one. Is that per person, and does it count canceled trips?
The $44 per user day for recreation. So that's that was based on so there's a whole kind of economic literature that looks at the value of recreation. It uses a model that kind of simulates decisions, to go to the beach or not go to the beach, and based on those decisions and based on the costs incurred and people's income, figures out kind of what people value, how much people value those trips above and beyond the cost that they incur for them. So that $44 is the average value that people place on a user day, and so we basically applied that to all canceled trips that we estimate in the analysis.
Oh, thank you. And our next question is, did you base the spills on data from up to 2002? Much has changed in 20 years. All units are now double hold and all tugs are USCG inspected.
So the response costs information that was based on spills from 1980 to 2002. So certainly, there probably have been changes since then. Kind of scouring the literature for information that we could use to estimate response costs, that was the best source we could find at the time. And so I think what that question suggests is that response costs potentially could be lower today for those spills. But I wasn't sure if the question was about the response costs or the spill scenarios themselves in terms of what we assumed about the volume per spill. And on the volume per spill, I would refer the questioner to the report that kind of goes into the details of how each of those was defined, because it varied a lot based on the scenario. We wanted to have a range of spill volumes, and so we wanted to have something kind of in each of those orders of magnitude.
Our next question is, does this data capture out-of-state visitors? So are the deterred recreators mostly out of state?
The deterred recreators includes Delaware residents as well as non-Delaware residents. I would have to double check the extent of the survey, but I believe it was based on a survey for the Eastern Seaboard. So it may not capture people from California coming to Delaware, but we're pretty confident that most of the people attending Delaware beaches are East Coast based for the most part. So while it may underestimate a little bit, we don't think that effect is significant.
Next question. Are there any long-term impacts to fisheries caused by the environmental impacts?
That's a good question. Something we wrestled with. There potentially could be, but we didn't want to necessarily assume that. That for any of these effects, there can be very spill-specific effects depending on where it is. In particular, if shellfish beds get oiled, that can have a pretty lasting effect. Based on the spill location we had, and just again drawing on information from past spills, we wanted to be aligned with that. Our analysis does not assume that, but that's not to say that that's out of the realm of possibility.
Okay. And another question. How often is baseline data in these categories updated? Is there a need to be updated more often?
The baseline data are variable in terms of their frequency of being updated. So commercial fishing data are published by NOAA pretty much every year. And so we use what was the most recent data available at the time that we did this in that case. Recreational data is updated much less frequently and more irregularly. Government agencies sometimes conduct broad-based surveys looking at recreational use for different coastal areas. Academic researchers conduct surveys. I mean, that's what we relied upon, but they're not on any set cycle, unfortunately. We were fortunate in this case that one of the preeminent recreational economists in the U.S. happens to be at the University of Delaware, and so we worked with him to develop what we thought were pretty good estimates for Delaware and for the spatial allocation across those 6 beach areas that we highlighted. And then for and that's beach use. And then for fishing, actually for recreational fishing, NOAA does publish data on a fairly regular basis. And for boating, that's I'd say even less frequent than beach use in terms of how often it's updated. We just happened to find a relatively recent survey that we were able to use for the purposes of this analysis.
That is all we have time for today. Jason has graciously offered, if you have questions, you can follow up with him. His email's right here. You can ask him questions and he will follow up with you. I wanted to thank you all for joining, and Jason, thank you so much for coming today and presenting on this topic. We will be sending a link to the recording. It already actually is in the chat if you would like to go ahead and grab that now, and you will also get a link in an email. And we will hope to work with you all again. Thank you very much, and we will see you later.